I didn't cry at my stepdaughter's wedding. I just smiled, signed the check, and quietly began making plans. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a man who makes decisions out of anger. I turned 63 last March, and by that point in a man's life, he either learns to breathe before he reacts or he spends his final decades burning things down. I learned to breathe a long time ago. What I did the night of the wedding, what I left on that table, was not an act of rage. It was the quietest, most deliberate thing I have ever done. My wife's daughter is 26 years old. Her name is Serena. No, wait. I keep catching myself. I used that name in a story I told a friend once, and it stuck. Let me use her real nickname, the one her mother calls her, Bree. Not short for anything, just Bree. She has been in my life since she was 11 years old, which means I have known her for 15 years. 15 years of school pickups, of helping her with college applications at midnight, of lending her money I never asked back for, of sitting in the front row at her college graduation with a bouquet of yellow tulips because her mother told me yellow was her favorite color. I never asked her to call me Dad. I want to be clear about that too. I never pushed it. I figured that kind of thing had to come naturally if it came at all. Her biological father had been out of the picture since she was 8, and I never used that as leverage. I just showed up. Every day for 15 years, I just showed up. Her mother, my wife, Diane, and I got married 9 years ago. Good years, mostly. Diane is a warm woman, generous, funny in that dry way I have always found attractive. But she has a blind spot where her daughter is concerned, and I think on some level I always knew that. I told myself it was understandable. What mother doesn't have a blind spot for her child? I told myself that right up until the night of the wedding, when I finally understood that a blind spot and a closed eye are two very different things. Bree met her fiancé. I'll call him Trace because that is what everyone called him, short for his middle name Tracer, which his parents apparently thought was charming, about 3 years ago. He is 29, works in insurance, and has a way of looking at you like he is calculating what you're worth before he decides how to treat you. I noticed it the first time Bree brought him to Sunday dinner. He shook my hand, looked me up and down, said, "So you're the stepdad," with a small smile that was not entirely a smile. I let it go. I have broad shoulders. I have been letting things go for a long time. The engagement came about 18 months ago. Bree called the house, not my cell, the house phone, which told me something, and I happened to pick up. "Oh," she said, "I was hoping to catch Mom." I told her Diane was in the garden and I'd go get her. She said, "Actually, could you just tell her Trace proposed? We can talk details later." Then she hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment with the receiver still in my hand. I thought about that moment later, much later, when I was sitting alone in a hotel room 50 miles away and trying to understand how things had gotten to where they had. I was the one who offered to pay for the wedding. I need you to understand that. Nobody asked me. Diane and I talked about it, and I said, "Look, Bree deserves a real celebration, and we have the money, and I want to do this for her." Diane teared up. She hugged me. She said, "You are the most generous man I have ever known." I believed her when she said it. I think she believed it too. The budget ended up being $42,000. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $42,000. The venue alone was $18,000. The catering was another $11,000. Flowers, photographer, band, cake, the honeymoon deposit I threw in as a gift, it added up fast. I wrote every check, I made every call. There were nights I was on the phone with the caterer until 10 o'clock ironing out the menu because Trace had dietary preferences that apparently required individual negotiation. Bree was not warm to me during the planning. That is the most accurate way I can put it. She was not rude, exactly. She was just distant, professional, almost. Like I was a vendor rather than the man who had been at her kitchen table every morning for 9 years. When she had a question about the budget, she texted Diane. When the venue needed a credit card on file, Diane would forward the email to me with a little note. "Can you handle this, honey?" I handled it, every time. There was one evening, about 6 weeks before the wedding, when I drove to Bree and Trace's apartment to drop off a check for the florist. They wanted cash or check, old-fashioned that way, and Trace opened the door. He looked at the envelope in my hand. He took it without saying anything, then called over his shoulder, "Bree, the money's here. Not your stepdad's here. Not Walter's here. The money." I stood at the door for a moment, and then Bree appeared behind him, and she took the envelope, said thanks, and they closed the door. I walked back to my car. I sat there in the parking lot for a while before I started the engine. I did not tell Diane about that. I should have. I see that now. But at the time I told myself it was a small thing, that Trace was just socially awkward, that Bree was stressed about the wedding. I told myself a lot of things. The wedding was on a Saturday in late October. The venue was a converted farmhouse about 30 miles outside the city, the kind of place with string lights and old oak trees, and a barn they'd fixed up for dancing. I'll admit it was beautiful. I had picked it out, actually, Diane had narrowed it down to 3 options and asked me to make the final call. I chose the farmhouse because Bree had mentioned once, years ago, that she had always pictured getting married somewhere that felt like fall. I remember that detail because I had been storing details like that for 15 years. Little things Bree had said in passing, things she probably didn't remember saying. I had been paying attention all along. The ceremony was as lovely. Bree looked beautiful. Diane cried from the moment Bree appeared at the end of the aisle, and I put my arm around her and handed her a handkerchief. I had thought to bring one, because I knew she'd need it. That is the kind of man I am. Or was. Or still am, I suppose. That hasn't changed. What changed is my understanding of what that kind of attention is worth to certain people. The reception was where it happened. After dinner, Trace's best man gave a toast, which was fine. A little too many inside jokes, but fine. Then Bree stood up. I hadn't known she was planning to give a speech. She had this index card she'd written on, and she tapped her glass, and the room went quiet. She started by thanking Trace's parents. She called them by name, said they had welcomed her into their family with open arms, said she already thought of his mother as a second mom. The room made the warm sounds a room makes when it hears something sweet. I smiled. I reached for my wine glass, then she thanked her mother. That part was long and beautiful, and made Diane cry again, which was right, and as it should be. I sat there and felt genuinely happy for both of them. Then she moved on. She thanked the bridesmaids. She thanked the florist, who was apparently a family friend of Trace's. She thanked the venue coordinator by name. She thanked the band. She did not thank me. Not by name, not by relationship, not even a vague gesture in my direction. I sat at that table and listened to her reach the end of her remarks. And most of all, thank you to everyone here for being part of this beautiful day. And there was nothing. The $42,000, the 15 years, the school pickups and the midnight college essays and the yellow tulips. Nothing. I did not react. I picked up my wine glass and I took a sip and I set it back down on the white tablecloth. Diane was still dabbing her eyes. She hadn't noticed. Or she had noticed and was hoping I hadn't. I don't know which is worse. About 20 minutes later, Bree came by the table. She hugged her mother. Then she looked at me, gave me a small smile and said, "Isn't everything just perfect?" Then she moved on to the next table. I excused myself. I told Diane I needed some air. I walked outside to the parking lot, and I stood next to my car, and I looked up at the sky for a while. October sky, very clear, a lot of stars. I thought about the man I had been for 15 years. I thought about the envelope at the apartment door. The money's here. I thought about every time I had told myself it was a small thing, that she was just stressed, that things would get better once she was older, once she was settled, once she felt more secure. I thought, she is 26 years old. She is married now. She is settled. Nothing is going to get better because as far as she is concerned, nothing is wrong. I went back inside. I did not make a scene. I danced with my wife. I smiled at the photographs. I hugged Bree before we left and told her she looked beautiful because she did. And because I am not the kind of man who takes things out on people in the moment. But on the drive home, I was quiet. Diane said, "You okay?" I said, "Tired." She reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "It was a perfect day." And I said, "It really was." And I meant it, in a way. It had been a perfect day. It had also been the day I finally saw something I had been avoiding seeing for 15 years. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I went through it all again. Slowly, the way you do when you are trying to be honest with yourself. Was I overreacting? Maybe she had just been nervous and forgot. But I thought about how carefully she had written that index card. She had thanked the florist. She had thanked the venue coordinator. Those were deliberate inclusions. My absence was also deliberate. In the morning, I got up early before Diane was awake, and I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my laptop. I looked at the accounts. We had a joint account for household expenses, and I had been the one depositing into it for years, since Diane worked part-time and I was the primary earner. I looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I opened a new browser tab and started reading. I want to say this carefully because I know how it sounds. I did not do what I did next out of spite. I did it because I finally understood something. I had spent 15 years being generous with someone who did not value my generosity, and I had kept being generous because I kept telling myself that one day she would. But the speech at the wedding, that was not an accident or an oversight. That was a statement. And now that I understood the statement, I needed to respond to it. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved quietly. I am a methodical man by nature. I spent 30 years as a civil engineer, and you do not build bridges by making impulsive decisions. I consulted a financial advisor I had known for years, a man who had no connection to Diane or her family. I spoke with an attorney, briefly, just to understand my options. I did not tell Diane any of this. I know that sounds cold, but I needed to think clearly before I talked, because I knew that once I talked, the conversation would move faster than my thinking. I also, during those 3 weeks, started paying attention differently, not snooping, just noticing how Diane talked about Bree, how often she mentioned Trace, whether she ever brought up the wedding speech, even obliquely. She did not once, which told me she either hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided it was not worth discussing with me. I also paid attention to the small things, the way you do when you finally take off the glasses you've been wearing, that make everything look a little warmer than it is. Diane had a way of saying Bree needs that preceded a request I was expected to fulfill. Bree needed help moving some furniture to the new apartment. Bree needed a cosigner on a car loan because her credit wasn't strong enough yet. Bree needed someone to look at a weird clause in their lease. I had done all of these things without being asked twice, and without Bree ever initiating contact with me directly. It was always through Diane. I was a resource, a useful one, but a resource. About 4 weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday evening, Diane mentioned that Bree and Trace were having some financial strain getting settled into the new place, and that Bree had mentioned it might be nice to have some help. She said it lightly, the way you say something when you want it to land softly. She was at the counter chopping vegetables. She didn't look up when she said it. I said, "How much?" She said, "She mentioned maybe 5,000, just a loan." I said, "Okay, let me think about it." Diane looked up then. She seemed surprised. I had never said let me think about it before. I had always just said yes. I said, "I just want to think about it. That's all." She nodded slowly and went back to the vegetables. That was the moment, I think, when she began to understand that something had shifted. She didn't ask me about it directly for a few more days. When she finally did, on a Saturday morning over coffee, she sat down across from me and said, "Is something going on with you?" I put my cup down. I said, "I've been thinking about the wedding." She was very still. I said, "Bree's speech." Diane closed her eyes for just a moment, so she had noticed. She had noticed, and she had said nothing to me for 4 weeks. I didn't raise my voice. I told her what I had observed, not as an accusation, just as a series of facts. 15 years, $42,000. The florist was thanked by name. I was not mentioned. She had said the money's here at the apartment door, and I had not told Diane about that, and I told her now. Diane said, "I'm sure she didn't mean." I said, "Diane, I need you to not do that right now." She stopped. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to hear that. I'm not sitting here wanting an apology or a scene. I just need you to see this clearly with me, because I have been not seeing it clearly for a very long time." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What do you want me to do?" And as I said, "I don't know yet." That was honest. I didn't know yet. I knew what I had already done. I had separated a significant portion of my personal savings back into an individual account, quietly, legally, with advice from my attorney. I had not touched the joint household account, because I am not the kind of man who leaves his wife unable to pay the electric bill while he figures things out. But I had protected myself. For the first time in 15 years, I had actually protected myself. What I hadn't decided yet was what came next. Diane called Bree that afternoon. I didn't ask her to, and she didn't tell me she was going to. She just disappeared into the bedroom for about 45 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red. She sat down on the sofa and said she was nervous, and she blanked. She said she felt terrible about it. I said, "Did she call me to say that?" Diane looked at me. I said, "She knows my number." Bree did not call me that day. She called Diane 3 more times over the next week. I know because I could hear Diane's side of the conversations, hushed, in the other room. Once I heard Diane say, "I know, sweetheart, but you have to understand how it looked." Once I heard her say, "He's not angry, he's just," and then her voice dropped too low for me to hear. Bree did not call me. On a Thursday evening, 11 days after my conversation with Diane, my phone finally rang, and it was Bree. I let it ring twice, then I answered. She said, "Hi. Is this a good time?" I said. It was a pause. Then she said, "Mom said you were upset about the speech." I noticed the framing. "Mom said you were upset." Not I realized what I did. Not I owe you an apology. "Mom said you were upset," as though my being upset was the event rather than the thing that caused it. I said, "I wasn't upset, Bree." I was clarified. Another pause. She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I finally understood something I should have understood a while ago." She said, "I already told Mom I didn't mean to leave you out." I was nervous. I said, "You thanked the florist." Silence. I said, "You'd written the card out ahead of time. You thanked Trace's parents, the bridesmaids, the venue coordinator, and the florist. You'd been planning what to say. My name wasn't something you forgot. It was something you didn't include." More silence. Then, "I don't know what you want me to say." I said, "I don't want you to say anything in particular, Bree. I'm not trying to have an argument with you. I'm just telling you what I observed." She said, "I feel like you're attacking me on my honeymoon." They had gotten back 2 weeks prior. The honeymoon comment was strategic, meant to make me feel that I was the one being unreasonable. I said, "I hope you had a wonderful honeymoon. I mean that." Then I said, "I'm going to be honest with you about something. I have spent 15 years trying to be a positive presence in your life. I never asked for anything in return, and I don't ask for it now. But I think you've understood for a long time that I would keep showing up and keep giving regardless of how I was treated, and I think that understanding has shaped how you've treated me, and I'm not going to operate that way anymore." She said, "What does that mean? Are you going to stop helping us?" And there it was. Not, "I'm sorry I hurt you." Not, "You've been so good to me and I've taken that for granted." The immediate instinct was to find out what it would cost her. I said, "I haven't decided anything. I just wanted you to know where I stand." She said, "Mom is going to be devastated if you blow up our family over a wedding speech." I said very quietly, "Your mother and I will figure out our marriage. That's between us." Then I said goodnight, and I hung up. I sat in the living room for a long time after that. The house was quiet. Diane had gone to bed early, said she had a headache, which she probably did. I sat there and I thought about who I had been and who I was now, and whether those two people were so different or just finally looking at each other honestly. I thought about the years. I thought about the yellow tulips at the graduation. I thought about midnight college applications and furniture moves and co-signed car loans. I thought about an envelope at an apartment door and a voice calling back, "The money's here." I did not regret any of it. That surprised me a little. I thought I might feel bitter about it, but I didn't. I had given what I gave because I chose to, and the choices were mine. What I regretted was the story I had been telling myself about what those choices meant to her. That story had been mine, not hers. She had been telling a different story all along, and I just hadn't been listening. Diane and I have been in counseling now for about 6 weeks. It is not comfortable, but it is honest, and honesty is something I have come to value more than comfort. Our counselor is a calm woman who has a way of asking questions that make you hear yourself. Last week she asked Diane, "Did you know your daughter hadn't included your husband in the speech before he told you?" And Diane looked at the floor for a long moment, and then she said yes. That yes cost her something. I watched it cost her, and I gave her credit for saying it. We are not done, Diane and I. I don't know yet what done looks like or if that's where we're headed. What I know is that I am no longer the man who will sign a check and smile and ask for nothing and tell himself that nothing is what he needs. I am 63 years old. I have maybe 20-25 good years left if I'm lucky and take care of myself. I am not going to spend them being furniture in someone else's house. The $5,000 Bree asked for, I did not give it. I told Diane I wasn't comfortable with it, and Diane, to her credit, told Bree that it wasn't a good time. Bree has not reached out to me since our phone call. I did not expect her to, and I find that I am at peace with it. Maybe someday she will understand what she had. Maybe she won't. That is her work to do, not mine. What I left on that table, metaphorically speaking, since I stayed through the whole reception and danced with my wife and kept my dignity intact, was the version of me that would have kept giving forever without asking why. I left him there between the centerpieces and the half-eaten wedding cake, under those string lights in the oak trees that I had paid for and chosen and loved because I thought she would love them too. I walked out of that farmhouse a different man than I walked in. It just took me a few weeks to notice.